and welcome back to Storytime with Alex. Reading from Allbyon to Britannia, Book 3, The Last Wizard by Brandy Pearson. We are now on Chapter 12. Everyone has been rescued, which is lovely. However, the nasty mob is still out there. Ruth still needs to tell her mum about her magic. It's all kinds of things. Who knows what's going to happen next? So sit back, relax. Chapter 12, The Nasty Mob, Brenda Brown and Ruth's mum. However, we had no illusions that the Blacks and Brenda Brown had given up. Brenda Brown must still want revenge, and the Blacks must still crave true magic, not to rejoice in it, but to warp it to their own dark ends. As Dad said, what they desired was power over others. Rose was busy with Ada and Leia, but Father Joe often came to see us and had long talks with Mum and Dad after I was encouraged to go to bed. Among other things, he was trying to get somewhere for Leia and Ada to live and get Leia back into school. He was also helping them with the police. He wanted the Blacks prosecuted for locking Ada away and stealing her pension, and thought it would be quite easy to do without having to mention anything about magic. And then everything happened at once. Ruth's mum phoned Dad and asked if she could come round and discuss some strange things that Ruth had told her. She seemed more concerned that Ruth was going mad than entertaining the possibility that what Ruth had told her was true, so Dad invited Ruth and her mum to dinner. Rose was going to Miss P next door so that she could be called on if needed. Rose had been working with Ada, who was feeling much better. It seemed that her confusion was not Alzheimer's disease, but something to do with magic, though Rose did not quite know what it was. Miss P had agreed to phone Sebastian about it, and had somehow persuaded him to come over as well. Miss P thought it was only right to invite Father Joe too. The only people missing were Leia and Ada. Ada was much happier safe in Rose's cottage, and Rose was happy to leave her with Leia. Of course, Brenda Brown's spy knew that Miss P was back, but did not know how many people she invited to dinner that night. It also became clear later that whoever it was, they lived further along our road towards the main road and did not see Rose coming in the opposite direction. Sebastian was very aware that there was a spy and used his invisibility spell to come into the triangle. He jumped over the front fence and went around to the back door, where he gave Miss P a bit of a fright by reappearing as she was looking out of her window. Rose thought he seemed to have cheered up. Father Joe was late because he had to visit someone from the parish first to prepare for a funeral he was going to take. When Vlad Black drove up to Miss P's cottage with Brenda Brown and the rest of the mob in the back of his white van, they thought Miss P was in her house alone. Luckily, Dad and I were upstairs looking out of his bedroom window as they drew up. We were waiting for Ruth and her mum and nervous about what was going to happen. Dad saw the white van and realised who it was. He phoned Sebastian next door to warn them. Vlad climbed out of his van, holding a blanket of some kind. Brenda Brown climbed out of the passenger seat. She was holding something small carefully in her hand. By the way she was holding it, I guessed it was a syringe. Dad passed all of this on to Sebastian. It was a quiet evening in the triangle, and there was no one else in the road. Vlad and Brenda Brown approached Miss P's front door. He stood to one side, and Mrs. Brown rang the doorbell. By now, Dad and I had run downstairs and out of our front door, so we saw all that happened. Sebastian must have warned Miss P. Her front door opened, but Miss P was at the other end of the hallway. "Brenda Brown," she called out, "you're a stupid woman. You persisted in thinking I was a witch for years when you lived here, even though I never ever performed the slightest hint of magic. I am not a witch." Brenda lunged at her through the front door with the syringe. "But I am," Rose cried, coming out from behind the open door. She waved her hand and the syringe flew from Brenda Brown's fingers and embedded itself in the wooden surround of the barometer. She sang a little phrase and Brenda crumpled to the floor, fast asleep. Meanwhile, Sebastian had run out of the back door and around the side of the house. He seemed to have a wand in his hand, though later I realised it was a wooden spoon he was holding by the bowl. He was still wearing the trousers and the waistcoat of Dad's grey suit, with a bright red shirt and a black bow tie. He had completely shaved his head, apart from a little quiff at the front like Tintin. He'd done something to his moustache so that it curled up on either side. He had divided his goatee beard in two and looked extraordinary. He pointed the wand, spoon, at Vlad and shouted a spell. Vlad had taken a step back in alarm and froze. Then he waved his spoon again, and Brenda, still asleep, floated out of Miss P's front hall. Vlad also rose in the air and, stiff as a board, joined her floating towards the white van. Hecate and the mob had already opened the back doors, ready to bundle Miss P in the back. Hecate realised it had all gone horribly wrong, ran around the front of the van and climbed into the driving seat. Vlad and Brenda cannoned into the rest of the mob and they fell back against the van, but scrambled to their feet. In the loudest voice, booming with magic, that I have ever heard coming from his mouth, Sebastian shouted, "Go away!" They scrambled back into the van, taking Brenda and Vlad with them, and drove away. That was when I saw Ruth and her mum. They had arrived at our front gate just as Mrs. Brown floated out of Miss P's house. They had seen everything else. Ruth started to clap and cheer. Her mum just stood there with her mouth open. Dad turned and saw her. "Hello, Eleanor. It's so nice to see you. Please come in." He came to the front gate, opened it and ushered her through. Ruth took her arm and gently guided her up the path. "I do honestly know how you must be feeling at the moment," he continued. "Come and have a drink. We have a lot to talk about." She was not someone with much practice at being speechless, but she came into the house without a word. Before following them, I looked around. There were several twitching curtains. Mrs. Carr was standing at her front door. Sebastian had been very loud, and several of our neighbours had heard and seen at least some of what had happened. I think everyone's cover had been blown, but I was so pleased to see Sebastian again. He seemed so much more cheerful than when we had last seen him. I waved at him, and he smiled at me. I wanted to go over and hug him. However, first there was Ruth's mum to deal with. Somehow, Rose was already in our lounge by the time Ruth's mum was ushered in. Dad had gone into the kitchen and returned with a gin and tonic. From her reaction when she sipped it, it was very strong. "Firstly," Dad started, "I need to apologise for all the things we haven't told you after the last couple of years. These were not about deceiving you, but about feeling the need to keep other people's secrets." "No," said Ruth's mum, "that's not it at all. You don't understand. I need to tell you something. Something that happened to me when I was Ruth's age, perhaps even younger. I've spent years pretending it didn't happen." She was beginning to look quite angry. "And I pretended it didn't happen because I was told it couldn't happen, but it did. Just like I saw that man with the black hair float through the air just now when that friend of yours pointed a spoon at him." This is Eleanor's story. When you're small, everything you do is entirely normal, whatever it is. Ruth will be surprised to know that I loved gardening. I would plant seeds in pots and I would sing to them so that they would grow quickly. I thought that was what everyone did. I heard people say that they talked to their plants and that it helped them grow, so I thought I was doing the same thing, but I wasn't. I could plant a seed and sing my little song and it would pop up out of the soil in a few minutes. Then, when I was about 6, I went to stay with my Nan, the one with the green eyes like Ruth and I have, and Rose has. Mum knew how much I liked gardening, so she gave me some seeds to take with me to plant in some pots in Nan's backyard. So Nan gave me a bag of potting compost and some little plant pots and a trowel and a dibber, and I happily sat in her yard, filled the pots with compost and planted the seeds. Then I sang to them, just as I always did. Perhaps my mum had never noticed, or she didn't care. Nan saw me doing it. She snatched the plant pot out of my hand and told me never ever to sing to plants ever again. I didn't know what I had done wrong. She told me it was extremely naughty, no singing to plants, no making any change by singing to it. Her attitude to me changed from that day on. She kept a close eye on me, especially around plants. She would pop over on unplanned visits to check up on me. She freaked me out, and after a while I would not dare to sing to plants or anything else. Eventually I would avoid having anything to do with growing things and the natural world. I even stopped singing because I didn't trust myself anymore. I would have nothing to do with anything that did not have a clear explanation. I got to be very good at numbers. They seemed to be reliable. I studied statistics at university, specialised in ecological statistics. Maybe it was the only way I could trust myself to have anything to do with the natural world. As time passed, I forgot I'd ever sung to plants and made them grow, until the day before yesterday when Ruth sang to a rose bush in our back garden, and a bud grew and blossomed. She'd been trying to explain about the magic, about being a witch, and I thought she was talking nonsense. No, worse than that. I was worried she was having a psychotic episode. I don't know what one of those is, but it sounds awful and I was frightened. I thought something awful was happening to my lovely daughter. I wanted to see you to find out if you thought Ruth might be going mad, and then I saw magic and I remembered. I remembered everything." She turned to Ruth. "I'm so sorry. There was nothing wrong with you. You can do magic. You call yourself a witch, and I believe you. If my Nan had not stopped me, perhaps I could have been a witch too." There was a stunned silence, eventually broken by Rose. "You know, I read that when your Nan was a little girl, the same sort of thing happened to her. Oh dear, what a family." Oh, that was Ruth's voice, but that was Rose speaking, just pretend. She shook her head. We all gave a huge sigh of relief and started talking at once, but Rose held up her hand and silenced us. "There is so much to tell you," she said, "but not tonight. Ruth, why don't we take your mother out into the garden for a breath of fresh air?" "What a good idea," said Ruth, who was so relieved that she couldn't stop grinning. She took her mother by the arm, gave her a daughterly squeeze, and the three of them left the room. Dad and I looked at each other. There was a knock at the door and Sebastian came in. "Oh, I've lost my place. There it is." "I'm so glad to see you," said Dad. "You look a lot more stylish in that suit than I ever have. I think it must be that extremely red shirt." "Cool, isn't it?" he said, grinning. "I've had an epiphany. I've decided that keeping myself secret just gives arseholes like the Blacks power over me. Sorry about the language, Miles. I suspect that if I'm to be your master, you're going to have to get used to it. Just don't repeat language like that in front of your mum and Dad." Dad ignored this. "What happened to you? You weren't like this the last time we saw you." "Something has happened to me that I do not understand. A rare event in my ridiculously long life. I have found it quite refreshing." He knocked back the rest of the gin and tonic that Ruth's mum had left on the table. "If there was another one of those, I would tell you my tale. For once I have a story every bit as those that Rose tell. Every bit as good." Sorry, I'm quite tired, so I feel like I sort of went off with my words at the end there, but that is the end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 is going to be Sebastian's story, so you'll have to come back to find out what has happened to Sebastian. But isn't it nice that he's back and feeling himself? See you next time.